The pounding on my front door started at exactly 9:47 on a Tuesday night. I remember the time so clearly because I was staring at the microwave clock when the first hit landed on the wood. "Open up, you ruined everything." My husband Derek's voice cracked on the last word, high, desperate, nothing like the confident man I'd married 19 years ago. I stood in my own hallway with my arms crossed, my back pressed flat against the cool plaster wall. And I did not move toward that door, not one single inch. 3 days earlier I still believed I had a marriage worth fighting for. My name is Amanda Reynolds. I'm 42 years old, and I work as a medical records supervisor for a hospital system right here in Nashville, Tennessee. It's a job that taught me something long before any of this ever happened. Paperwork never lies, even when people do. I'd spent 19 years married to Derek, a guy who built a home renovation company from nothing more than a beat-up truck and a handful of tools. For most of those years, I was genuinely proud of him, proud of us. I honestly believed we were the kind of couple who had each other's backs, who understood that marriage meant carrying the weight together when life got heavy. I found out just how wrong I was on a Saturday morning, standing in a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, watching my mother's face turn grey. My mom, Patricia Harris, is 68 years old. She raised my sister Lauren and me all on her own after my dad passed away. She worked double shifts at a diner for years, scraping by, until she finally retired with nothing but a small pension and her pride. She has never once asked me for a single thing in her entire life. So when she called me that morning, her voice thin and strange, saying she couldn't catch her breath, I dropped everything and drove to her place so fast I almost missed the turn onto her street. By the time the paramedics got her stable and the cardiologist pulled me into a private room with his clipboard and that careful doctor tone, I already knew it was bad. "A valve replacement," he said. "Urgent, not quite an emergency, but close enough that waiting wasn't really an option." And then came the number that changed everything, $6,200, due before they'd even schedule the surgery. Deductible and copay all at once, because that's how insurance works when you've spent your whole life just barely getting by. I didn't have it. Not sitting in any account, not without dipping into things I couldn't touch. But Derek and I did have it, or at least I thought we did. We'd just closed on a lake house up near Old Hickory. A family investment, he'd called it, the kind of purchase that made him puff his chest out a little when he talked about it over dinner. I remember thinking, standing in that hospital hallway with my mother's chart in my hands, that this was exactly what a marriage was supposed to be for. You build something together so that when the ground shakes beneath you, you have something solid to stand on. So I called him. He picked up on the third ring and I could hear the TV blaring in the background, some game show buzzer going off. I told him about my mom, about the surgery, about the number. I kept my voice steady because that's what I do. I stay calm, I fix problems, I don't fall apart in hospital hallways. I asked him if we could pull from savings just until I figured out a longer-term plan. There was a pause, a long, heavy one. "We just bought the lake house," he said, like I'd somehow forgotten, like I was the one being completely unreasonable. "Figure it out yourself." I actually laughed one short, disbelieving breath, because surely I'd misheard him. Surely my husband of 19 years had not just told me to figure out my dying mother's heart surgery on my own, 3 days after signing papers on a vacation property. But before I could say another word, I heard fabric rustling, the phone changing hands, and then Carol's voice. My mother-in-law, sharp as a kitchen knife, even when she was trying to sound reasonable. "Stop calling my son," she said. "Go ask your own family," and then the line went dead. I stood there holding my phone, the hospital's fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my mother somewhere behind a set of double doors waiting to find out if she'd get her surgery on time or if we'd have to delay it, gamble with her heart because the money just wasn't there. I looked down at the screen at the call log that read, "Derek, 3 minutes 12 seconds. And something inside my chest went very, very quiet. And very, very cold. 19 years. 2 kids we'd raised and sent off into their own lives. Every anniversary dinner, every late night when his business nearly tanked and I picked up extra shifts to keep us afloat. Every single time I told myself that love meant showing up, even when it wasn't convenient. And in 3 minutes and 12 seconds, all of it had been reduced to 3 words. Figure it out yourself. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect me to say I broke down in that hallway, but I didn't. What I felt was stranger than grief. It was clarity. A door closing somewhere deep inside me, quiet and final. The kind of sound you only notice in the silence afterward. I folded the insurance paperwork in my hands until the creases went sharp, and I walked back toward the waiting room where my sister Lauren was sitting with her coat still on. And for the first time in my marriage, I let myself think the thought all the way through. Maybe I have never really been his priority at all. I had no idea, standing there, that the phone call I'd just survived was nothing compared to what was coming. I had no idea that in 3 days, that same man would be pounding on my front door, screaming that I had ruined him. I didn't know yet what he'd been hiding. I didn't know about the envelope waiting for me, or the letter inside it, or the words that would end up changing the entire direction of my life. I only knew one thing, standing in that hallway with my mother's surgery still hanging in the balance. I needed $6,200, and my husband had just told me I was completely on my own. My mother's surgery was scheduled for 6 o'clock the next morning, which meant somehow, some way that money had to be in place by the end of the day. I spent the afternoon doing the math. My checking account, my sister Lauren's modest teacher's salary, a credit card with a limit that wouldn't even cover half of it. Lauren offered everything she had without hesitation, and I loved her so much for that. But even combined, we were still short by more than I wanted to admit out loud. I was sitting in a plastic chair in the surgical waiting area around 7 that evening, staring at nothing, when I noticed a familiar figure walking down the corridor toward me. William Reynolds. My father-in-law moved a lot slower these days than he used to, but there was something purposeful in his step that evening, like a man who'd made a decision and wasn't going to let himself second-guess it. William is 72, a retired CPA, the kind of guy who spent 40 years balancing other people's books and somehow ended up raising a son who couldn't balance his own conscience. He and I had always gotten along in a quiet, understated way. He never said much at family dinners, just watched, the way accountants tend to watch everything, cataloguing details other people missed. He sat down beside me without a word and pressed an envelope into my hands. It was heavier than I expected. "Don't open it here," he said, his voice low. "Wait until you're alone." I asked him what it was, and he just shook his head, patted my hand once, and told me to take care of my mother. Then he stood up and walked back down that same corridor. I remember thinking he looked like a man walking away from something he'd been carrying for a very, very long time. I didn't wait as long as he asked. I went to the family restroom down the hall, locked the door, and opened the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside was a cashier's check for $6,200, made out exactly to the penny of what the hospital needed. And folded beneath it, a single sheet of paper in William's careful, old-fashioned handwriting. "Derek has been lying to you for years. Don't trust anything about that lake house. I should have told you sooner. I'm so sorry." I read it 3 times. Each time the words meant less and more at the same time. Less because I couldn't yet understand what they really meant. More because I understood somewhere deep in my gut that they meant something enormous. I got the check to admissions before the deadline. My mother went into surgery the next morning as scheduled, and I sat in that same waiting room for 4 hours that felt like 40. Watching the little status board update from in surgery, to closing, to finally recovery. When the surgeon came out, still in his scrubs, and told me the valve replacement had gone perfectly, I put my face in my hands and let myself cry for the first time in 3 days. Not from fear anymore, but from relief so sharp it almost hurt. William was there again that afternoon, sitting a few chairs down, waiting for me to come back out after I'd seen my mom settled in recovery. He didn't say anything at first. He just handed me a paper cup of vending machine coffee and let me sit with it. "Thank you," I finally said, "for the check." "I don't know how to." "You don't need to thank me," he said, cutting me off gently. "You need to listen." He told me in that same careful voice he probably once used to explain tax codes to nervous clients that the lake house wasn't what I believed it to be. I told him I didn't understand. We'd closed on it together. I'd signed papers, I'd seen the listing. "Did you see the deed?" he asked. I hadn't. I'd seen a stack of papers Derek had put in front of me one evening, distracted, tired after a 12-hour shift. And I'd signed where he told me to sign because I trusted him. Because 19 years of marriage teaches you to trust the shorthand, the shortcuts, the "just sign here, honey, I'll explain later" that never actually gets explained. William's jaw tightened. He looked for a moment like a man carrying something so heavy it had started to bend him. "He never intended for you to own it," he said quietly. I sat there in that hospital hallway, my mother alive and recovering just down the corridor, my husband's father sitting beside me with a truth he'd clearly been holding onto for longer than either of us wanted to admit. And I felt the same cold clarity from 3 days earlier settle back into my chest. I thought about the phone call. "We just bought the lake house, figure it out yourself." I thought about Carol snatching the phone, about the ease with which she told me to go ask my own family, as if my family and his had never been the same thing at all. I looked at William and asked him the only question that mattered. "What else don't I know?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked down at his hands folded in his lap, an old man's hands, steady from decades of columns and figures and other people's secrets. "More than you think," he finally said, "but you're going to need proof before you're going to believe any of it, and so will everyone else." I didn't sleep that night. I sat by my mother's hospital bed, listening to the steady beep of the monitor that told me her heart was still working, still fighting, still hers. And I thought about my own heart, and how long it had been quietly working overtime to keep believing in something that might not have been real for a very long time. My mother came home from the hospital 4 days later, moving slowly, but breathing easier than she had in months. And once I knew she was stable, once Lauren had settled into the guest room to help with her recovery, I finally let myself sit down with the one question that had been circling my mind since William handed me that envelope. What else didn't I know? Lauren found me at my kitchen table that Thursday night, my laptop open in front of me, 3 different bank statements printed out and spread across the surface like evidence at a crime scene, because that's essentially what they were. She pulled up a chair without asking and looked over my shoulder. "What are we looking at?" she asked. "Our savings," I said, "or what's left of them." The number staring back at me from the screen made my stomach drop. An account that should have held close to $40,000, money we'd built together over a decade, money I'd watched grow through years of careful budgeting, now sat at just under $3,000. I scrolled back through the transaction history and there they were. Transfers I didn't recognize, amounts that made no sense against any purchase I could remember, all routed to an account number I'd never seen before. Lauren's voice was quiet but firm. "Amanda, you need to talk to a lawyer, tonight if you can." I wanted to argue with her, some old instinct in me still wanting to find an explanation that didn't end in betrayal, a business expense, a tax thing, something Derek would explain away with his easy confidence and that half smile that used to make me believe everything was fine. But the numbers didn't lie. And William's letter kept echoing in my mind, "He never intended for you to own it." Derek was staying with his parents that week, giving us both some space after the phone call, or so he claimed. It gave me the house to myself, and it gave me, for the first time in 19 years, the nerve to walk into his home office and actually look. I want to be honest, I'd never gone through his things before, not because I was afraid of what I'd find, but because I never had a reason to look. That's what trust does. It closes doors so gently you forget they're even there. The desk drawer wasn't locked. It wasn't even fully closed, just slightly ajar like he'd left in a hurry and never come back to straighten it out. Inside I found a manila folder thick with paper, bank loan applications, property documents, a mortgage file with the Lake House address printed across the top in bold black letters. I sat down on the floor of his office, my back against the wall, and went through every single page. The loan application listed our combined household income, which meant it listed mine, my salary, my job title, my years of employment, all typed neatly into a box that made the bank comfortable enough to approve a loan for a $210,000 lake property. He'd used my income to qualify. That part didn't surprise me. Married couples do that all the time, and there was nothing wrong with it on the surface. What stopped my breath was the deed itself, tucked beneath the loan paperwork, the ink still crisp like it had barely been handled. Sole owner Derek Reynolds. My name wasn't anywhere on it, not as a co-owner, not as a beneficiary, not even as a footnote. I checked the date, the same week we'd supposedly closed on the property together. The same week I remembered signing papers at the kitchen table, tired, distracted, trusting. I flipped to the signature page. There at the bottom was my name, Amanda L. Reynolds, in handwriting that looked almost exactly like mine. The same slight upward slant on the A, the same loop I make in the L. My eyes moved over it slowly. The way I'd learned to review documents at the hospital, checking for discrepancies in patient records, trained to notice when something looked right but wasn't quite right. The pressure was wrong. My signature always starts light and gets heavier toward the end, a habit from years of signing charts quickly. This signature was even throughout, deliberate, careful, the signature of someone imitating me rather than being me. I sat there on that office floor for a long time, the deed in my lap, feeling something shift permanently inside my chest. It wasn't shock anymore. Shock had already come and gone with the phone call, with the envelope, with the empty savings account. This was something colder and steadier. The feeling of watching the last piece of a puzzle click into a picture I didn't want to see, but couldn't unsee either. Someone had signed my name to a legal document. Someone had used my income to secure a loan I was never meant to benefit from. Someone had built an entire property, an entire secret, on the foundation of my trust, and then told me to figure out my mother's heart surgery on my own, because he'd just spent our money on a lake house that legally had nothing to do with me at all. I photographed every page with my phone before I put the folder back exactly where I'd found it, the edges aligned, the drawer left just slightly ajar, the way it had been. I didn't want him to know I'd seen it yet, not until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. That night I called Laura Bennett, a family and financial fraud attorney a colleague at the hospital had recommended years ago for an entirely different reason. I left a message asking for the earliest appointment she had. Then I sat in my dark living room, my phone in my hand, and looked one more time at the photograph of that signature. My name, in someone else's careful hand, and I understood that whatever was happening to my marriage was no longer about a lake house or a phone call. It was about how long exactly I had been lied to, and how much more I still didn't know. William called me 2 days later, early on a Saturday morning, his voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard from him before. He asked if I could come by his place while Carol was out at her weekly bridge game. I told him I could be there in 20 minutes, and I was. He met me at the side door instead of the front, which told me before he said a word that whatever this was, he didn't want Carol walking in on it. He led me through the kitchen and out to the garage, where a single bare bulb hung from the ceiling and rows of storage boxes lined the far wall, labelled in his neat accountant's handwriting. Taxes 2015, warranties, William Medical. He pulled one box down from a high shelf, one that wasn't labelled at all, and set it on the workbench between us. Derek asked me to hold this for him a few years back, he said. He told me it was overflow from his office, nothing important. I never had a reason to open it until now. Inside were file folders, neatly organised despite Derek's claim that it was just clutter. Tax records going back nearly a decade, mortgage documents, business ledgers from his renovation company, and a thick stack of printed emails. William had clearly already gone through some of it. Several pages had sticky notes on the edges, his handwriting marking dates and names. I started with the emails, because something in the way William avoided my eyes told me that's where the real weight of this box was sitting. Most of them were routine correspondence with his financial advisor, a man named Greg Patterson, about business investments and quarterly returns. But one email, dated almost 3 years back, made my hands go still on the paper. When Patricia passes away, Amanda will inherit the house. We'll refinance everything then and roll it into the lake property. Should give us enough equity to expand the business without touching our current accounts. I read it twice, then a third time, because I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining the words rearranging themselves into something less monstrous than what they actually said. My husband had written in plain language to his financial advisor a plan built around my mother's death, not her illness, not her mortality in the abstract way we all acknowledge our parents will someday leave us, but a specific, calculated plan, timed to her passing, designed to extract value from a home she'd worked her entire life to pay off. He's been planning this for years, William said quietly, watching my face. I found this folder 18 months ago. I should have shown you then. Why didn't you? I asked, and I didn't try to soften the edge in my voice. William sat down on an old stool near the workbench, looking older than I'd ever seen him, older than 72. Because he's my son, he said, and I kept telling myself he'd change, that it was just a phase, that the business pressure was getting to him. That once things settled down, he'd come back to being the man I raised. He shook his head slowly. I was wrong, and every day I didn't tell you I was choosing him over you. I'm not going to do that anymore. I didn't have the energy to be angry at William. Whatever guilt he was carrying, he'd carried it into that garage and finally set it down in front of me, which was more than Derek had ever done in 3 days of silence since the phone call. I went through the rest of the box slowly, methodically, the same way I'd process a patient's chart when something didn't add up, looking for the thread that connected every piece. There were more transfers I recognized now, the same unfamiliar account numbers from my own bank statements, feeding into what appeared to be a separate business account Derek had opened without my knowledge. One that didn't appear anywhere on our joint tax filings. There were notes about the lake house's projected resale value. Calculations for how much equity he expected to pull once the mortgage was refinanced, under terms that would somehow leave me even further removed from any legal claim to it. The most damning piece was a handwritten note tucked into the back of the folder, in Derek's own scrawl. The kind of casual, unguarded handwriting a person uses when they're jotting a thought down for no one but themselves. Amanda won't ask questions if I keep the numbers small enough. She trusts the process. I sat with that sentence for a long moment. She trusts the process. 19 years of marriage reduced to a strategy. A behavioral pattern he'd studied and exploited, the way he might study a renovation client's budget, looking for the path of least resistance. William watched me fold the note carefully and slide it back into the folder. "I know sorry doesn't undo any of it," he said, "but I am more sorry than I know how to say." I looked at this man who had raised the person I married, who had spent his whole career making sure numbers told the truth, and who had finally, however late, decided that truth mattered more than protecting his son. I reached over and put my hand on his. "You gave me the money for my mother's surgery," I said. "You didn't have to do that, and you didn't have to show me any of this today. I know what it's costing you." He nodded, not trusting his voice. And for a moment we just sat there in that dim garage, with the evidence of my marriage's collapse spread out on the workbench between us. When I finally stood to leave, I picked up my phone and called Laura Bennett's office, the family and fraud attorney I'd left a message for days earlier. Her assistant answered and told me Laura had a cancellation Monday morning if I could come in. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. Driving home, the box's contents photographed and saved in triplicate on my phone, I felt something solidify inside me that had been soft and hopeful for far too long. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bad month or a stressed husband making a thoughtless comment on a hard day. This was a plan, built carefully over years, waiting patiently for my mother to die so my husband could profit from her absence. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the engine, and sat there in the quiet for a long moment before I finally said the words out loud to no one but myself. Testing how they felt in my own voice, "I want a divorce." They felt, for the first time in 3 days, like the truest thing I'd said. Laura Bennett's office sat on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building downtown, the kind of place with worn hardwood floors and law degrees framed neatly on the walls. And from the moment I sat down across from her desk, I understood why my colleague had recommended her without hesitation. She listened to my entire story without interrupting once, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad. And when I finally slid my phone across the desk with the photographs of the deed, the emails, and Derek's handwritten note, she read through all of it in silence before looking up at me. "This is going to take some time to build properly," she said. "But Amanda, what you've brought me is more than enough to start." Over the following 2 weeks, Laura's office became something like a second job for me. I met with her 3 times, each session peeling back another layer of what Derek had constructed. She brought in a forensic accountant, a soft-spoken woman named Denise, who specialized in exactly this kind of financial unraveling. Together, they built a timeline that made my stomach turn every time I looked at it. The forgery on the deed was confirmed within the first week. A handwriting analyst Laura contracted compared my known signature against the one on the mortgage documents and found what she called inconsistencies significant enough to warrant further investigation. Professional language for what I already knew in my gut. Someone had signed my name. And the most likely candidate, given access to my signature style and motive, was sitting at his parents' house, waiting for me to come around. Denise traced the transfers from our joint savings account to a business account Derek had opened 18 months earlier, under a slightly different name than his renovation company, Reynolds Premier Holdings. A shell that existed, as far as either of them could tell, solely to move money somewhere I wouldn't think to look. Nearly $31,000 had passed through that account in the last year alone. Some of it funneled into the lake house down payment. Some of it simply gone, spent on things Denise was still working to identify. Laura filed a motion requesting a temporary freeze on our joint accounts and an injunction preventing the sale or refinancing of the lake house while the investigation continued. She warned me it might provoke him. She wasn't wrong. Derek called that same afternoon, then again an hour later, then 6 more times before dinner. I didn't answer any of them. By the end of that first week, my call log showed over 40 missed calls, along with a scattering of text messages that swung wildly between anger and something that almost resembled pleading. "We need to talk, you're being crazy. This is my father's fault, not mine. Call me back, Amanda. I mean it." I read every single message and answered none of them. Laura had been clear about that from the start. Anything I said now in anger or in doubt could be used against me later, twisted into something it wasn't. So I let the phone buzz on my counter and I focused instead on my mother, who was recovering well, sitting up in her recliner most afternoons, strong enough now to ask me pointed questions about why I seemed so distracted. I hadn't told her everything yet. I told her what I could manage, that Derek and I were having serious problems, that a divorce was likely, that I needed her to focus on healing and let me handle the rest. She studied my face the way mothers do, seeing straight through the edited version. but she didn't push. She just reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "You've always known how to handle things, Amanda. I trust you." The turning point in the case came from a source I hadn't expected to lean on so heavily: William. He came to Laura's office voluntarily without me even asking. He sat across from her for nearly 2 hours, walking her through everything he knew: the box from his garage, the emails between Derek and his financial advisor, the years he'd suspected something was wrong and said nothing. He signed a statement on the record, confirming the timeline of what he'd found, and when, along with his account of handing me the envelope at the hospital. Laura told me afterward that William's cooperation was, in her words, the strongest piece of leverage we have. A father testifying against his own son wasn't something juries or judges took lightly. It signaled more than any bank statement could that this wasn't a bitter spouse exaggerating grievances. This was a pattern, serious enough that even Derek's own family couldn't defend it. Carol predictably was furious when she learned what William had done. I heard about it secondhand through William himself, who called me one evening, sounding both exhausted and strangely lighter than I'd heard him in weeks. "She told me I was betraying our son," he said. "I told her I spent 30 years teaching people that numbers don't lie, and I wasn't about to start pretending they do now, not even for Derek." I asked him how he was holding up, genuinely concerned despite everything. He was quiet for a moment before answering. "Better than I expected," he said. "I think I've been carrying this a lot longer than I realized. It's strange how much lighter the truth feels, even when it's ugly." I understood exactly what he meant. Every day that passed with the case building, with evidence accumulating in neat, labeled folders on Laura's desk, I felt less like a woman whose life had been shattered, and more like someone slowly reconstructing solid ground beneath her feet. But peace, I was learning quickly, has a way of provoking the people who benefit from chaos. Derek's calls didn't stop. If anything, they multiplied. And one evening, scrolling through the string of unanswered messages on my phone, I noticed the tone shifting again. No longer angry, no longer pleading, but something colder and more calculated. "You have no idea what you're about to do to yourself, Amanda. Talk to me before this goes any further." I forwarded it straight to Laura without responding the way she'd instructed. She called me back within the hour. "He knows we're close to filing," she said, "which means he knows his father talked. Amanda, I need you to be prepared. Men like this don't handle losing control well. I want you to be careful over the next few days." I told her I would be. I didn't yet know how right she was to warn me. The temporary hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, in a courtroom that felt smaller than I expected. All beige walls and fluorescent light, nothing like the dramatic settings I'd seen on television. Laura sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, calm and composed in a way that steadied my own nerves. Across the aisle, Derek sat with his own attorney, refusing to look in my direction even once. I hadn't seen him in person since the phone call 3 weeks earlier. He looked thinner. His jaw tight, a man clearly unraveling under pressure he hadn't expected to face. Part of me, some small, stubborn piece I hadn't fully let go of, still ached at the sight of him. 19 years doesn't disappear just because the truth finally arrives, but that ache sat quietly beside a much stronger feeling now: clarity, and something close to resolve. Laura opened by presenting the forensic accountant's full report, walking the judge through the transfers into Reynolds Premier Holdings, the shell account Derek had used to siphon money away from our joint savings over the better part of 2 years. Denise took the stand and explained, in clear and measured language, exactly how the funds had moved, where they'd landed, and how the timing of those transfers aligned precisely with major expenses on the lake house. Then came the handwriting analyst, who testified that the signature on the mortgage documents showed measurable inconsistencies with my known signature, inconsistencies significant enough, in her professional opinion, to indicate the likelihood of forgery. Derek's attorney pushed back, tried to suggest natural variation in signatures over time, but the analyst held her ground, walking the judge through pressure points and letter formation with the patience of someone who had done this 100 times before. The email was the moment I felt the room shift. Laura read it aloud, slow and deliberate, letting every word land. "When Patricia passes away, Amanda will inherit the house. We'll refinance everything then and roll it into the lake property." I watched the judge's expression change as she heard it, a slight tightening around her eyes, the look of someone recalibrating everything she'd assumed about the man sitting at that table. And then William took the stand. I hadn't fully prepared myself for what it would feel like to watch my father-in-law sit in that witness chair and testify against his own son. His voice was steady, but I could see his hands trembling slightly where they rested on the wooden rail. He confirmed the timeline. Finding the emails 18 months earlier, the box in his garage, the envelope he'd handed me at the hospital. When Derek's attorney asked him, almost incredulously, why a father would testify against his own child, William looked directly at the judge and answered without hesitation. Because my son tried to build his future on my daughter-in-law's trust and on his mother-in-law's suffering. I spent my whole career making sure numbers told the truth. I wasn't going to stop now, just because the truth was inconvenient for my own family. The courtroom was silent for a moment after that. Even Derek's attorney seemed to pause before moving on. By the time the hearing concluded 3 hours later, the judge had heard enough. She ordered a formal investigation into potential financial fraud, froze all disputed accounts pending the outcome, and granted the injunction preventing any sale or refinancing of the lake house. Within days, the bank Derek had used for the mortgage suspended the loan, pending its own internal review of the forged signature. And his business line of credit, tied, it turned out, to some of the same falsified financial documents, was pulled entirely. I heard through Laura, who heard through opposing counsel, that Derek's renovation company was already struggling under the weight of frozen assets and a suspended credit line. Contracts he'd been counting on for the coming months were falling through. The life he'd built on borrowed money and borrowed trust was coming apart at a speed that seemed to catch even him off guard. I didn't feel triumphant watching it happen. I want to be honest about that. There was no satisfaction in watching a man I'd loved for 19 years lose everything piece by piece. Even a man who had lied to me, forged my name, and planned around my mother's death like it was a line item in a spreadsheet. What I felt instead was something quieter, the particular exhaustion of finally being believed, of watching a system built to protect people like me actually do its job. Carol called me twice that week, her voice sharp with an anger that had nowhere else to go now that William had chosen his side. She accused me of destroying her family, of turning her husband against her son, of caring more about money than 19 years of marriage. I let her finish both times without interrupting, and both times I simply said the same thing before hanging up. Derek destroyed this family long before I found out about it, Carol. I just stopped pretending he hadn't. Derek, for his part, went quiet for 2 days after the hearing. An uncharacteristic silence that Laura warned me not to trust. Men like this don't go quiet because they've accepted defeat, she told me over the phone. They go quiet because they're regrouping. She was right. On the third night my phone lit up with his name at nearly 11:00 p.m, and when I didn't answer, the calls kept coming one after another, faster and angrier than before. I turned my phone to silent and set it face down on my nightstand, but I couldn't quite fall asleep. Some old instinct, still listening for the sound of his truck in the driveway. I didn't have to wait long to find out if that instinct was right. Pounding started at 9:47 that Tuesday night, and by the time I recognized the rhythm, hard, uneven, furious, I already knew exactly who was standing on the other side of my door. "Open up, you've destroyed everything." I stood in my hallway, arms crossed, back against the cool plaster wall in the exact spot where this story began. Derek's voice cracked on the word destroyed. High and desperate, stripped of every ounce of the confidence I remembered from 19 years of marriage. I didn't move toward the door. I didn't reach for the handle. Instead, I pulled out my phone and pressed record, the way Laura had told me to if this ever happened. "Derek, you need to leave," I said through the door, keeping my voice level. "You froze my accounts. My father turned on me. Do you have any idea what you've done to my business?" His fist hit the door again, harder this time. "What did my father give you? What's in that box he's been hiding?" I noticed what he didn't ask. He didn't ask how my mother was recovering. He didn't ask if I was safe, alone in a house he was currently trying to break into with his voice, if not yet his hands. 3 weeks of collapse, and his only question was about what evidence I had against him. "Go home, Derek," I said. "The police are already on their way." I'd called them the moment I heard his truck in the driveway, some old instinct kicking in before conscious thought could catch up. But it wasn't the sirens that finally stopped him. It was headlights sweeping across my front yard as another car pulled in behind his truck. And William stepped out.